there's lots of challenges. There's, the increasing population. How do we deal with increasing production, but also food waste? But how can we do that increased production without having impact on our natural resources?
Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of global food systems. It's produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University. I'm Maureen Olevnik, Coordinator of Global Food Systems.
I'm Scott Denona. I'm a philosopher of science.
And I'm John Fabian. I'm a food scientist.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. At the very heart of sustainable food production is the health of soil. Not only does soil health and microbial community impact the production of food for humans and animals, soil can be a major player in the sequestration of carbon, a main variable to climate change. Our guest today is Dr. Chuck Rice, University Distinguished Professor and recipient of the Mary L. Vanier Professorship in the Department of Agronomy at K-State. Chuck's research goals are to find ways to improve and protect the environment, while also boosting agricultural productivity. In today's discussion, Chuck shares his thoughts on the many facets of the complex agriculture system, new technologies, water policy, and yes, soil health. Dr. Rice, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I've heard recently that you've received a $10 million USDA grant. Very exciting, and we will talk more about that as we get into it. But first, I'd like to hear a little background on who you are and how you got to where you are today.
Okay. Well, I actually grew up in Illinois, small town outside of Chicago. At that time, many years ago, it was a rural community. They called it the Super Boonies, Yorkville. But now it's part of the suburbs of Chicago. But I didn't really grow up on a farm, but I was active in 4-H. My parents, I was the first generation college student. My parents, my mom worked in a cafeteria, my dad worked in a factory, but they were really supportive of science education. They bought chemistry kits, and we had a microscope. We hatched an egg, cut a window in an egg, and watched the chick grow. So I had a lot of that kind of science background and that. And I had really some key teachers, third grade, third, fifth, and then freshmen in high school that were really instrumental in getting me involved in science. I guess I was attuned to science, but things like we made butter, and then, but what really got me started into science and biology related was my freshman high school biology teacher. He took a select group at the end of the year to the sand dunes in Michigan, and we studied this. We spent camping, but spent the time from looking at the development of plant communities from the lake, the beach dunes, all the way into the climax forest, which is a beech maple forest in western Michigan. So that kind of what's got me started, and then just certain things, moments in time in college. Got involved with water and soils in geography. I was a geography major. I switched in midterm, but to geography, and really got involved in soils particularly. Did an internship at Argonne National Lab on surface mine reclamation at that time. And then my advisor for college, I was thinking about doing a master's in land use planning at Northern Illinois, and he said, well, we've done about as much as we can do for you. You ought to go somewhere else. I got married, and took my wife and myself and went down to got an assistantship at Kentucky, do surface mine reclamation for my master's, and then stayed on for my PhD in soil microbiology, nitrogen cycling in no-till systems. So that was my first real indoctrination into agriculture.
You stated in some of the materials that I read online that soil microbiology impacts everything beyond the local level. It gets to be an international. Can you explain how that impacts and fits into the bigger picture, and how the bigger picture may bring information back to the local?
Right. Well, so soil microbiology is a relatively new field, particularly with the new techniques, but people don't really understand the value of soils, and particularly the microbes in soils. I often tell people for the human aspect that we only understand about 1%, or we can only cultivate 1% of the microbes in soil. So we know genetically there's the other 99%, but we really don't know their ecology. But yet that 1%, we get 90+% of our antibiotics for human health. We did a analysis. About 50% of our anti-cancer drugs, our immunosuppressant drugs, come from soils, which a lot of them are microbial origin. So the world's wide open for trying to discover what that under 99% are doing, both for human health, but also for this planet. And so, while I'm not necessarily doing the work on human health, I do quite a bit of work on what those microbes are doing in soil for agriculture, but also that affect the planet. And so the hot topic, no pun intended, but is the carbon cycle. So carbon stored in soils is about 2 to 3 times more than what's in vegetation on this planet. And a lot of that carbon is processed by the microbes. As you know, we're getting into fall here, tree leaves drop, corn, soybean residue, all that plant material is processed by the microbes, and a portion of that is then sequestered or stored in soils. So really understanding the global carbon cycle and those microbes, how they're involved, really affect our planet because of global rise in CO2 and the implications that has on climate change. But now we have the tools to understand those microbes and really to create healthier soils, store more carbon, become more efficient with nutrients.
So I take it you're no longer, or you, the scientific community, are no longer at quite the loss you were to be able to cultivate these? Is that part of the problem that you?
Yeah, that's still the case today. We know with the molecular techniques now, genomic analysis, that we know DNA strands, the DNA, but we really still can't cultivate a lot of those organisms. And we really need to have those tools so that we can understand the ecology. How do they fit in the soil environment? How they interact with each other? So we know the genetic potential and a little bit what their potential activities, but trying to figure out how they live in the soil, how they live on plant roots, the potential there for increasing efficiency, water resilience in crops is really key. It's really kind of the next frontier.
So how do you study some of this if you can't bring it into the lab and cultivate it? That's part of what you're talking about, right? It's sort of then being able to sort of in the lab then see what's going on. Are you at a loss if you can't do that, or are there things that you can do to study actually in the field?
Right. Yeah. So there's people that do the genomic analysis, and I guess I'm looking at the products of that microbial activity. So I look at processes, and not the individual organisms per se, but those groups of organisms and how they process nitrogen or how they process carbon. So I'm looking at the activity and what environmental factors affect that activity, but I don't know necessarily who they are. But I want to know what they're doing.
Right. A famous story when people were studying slime molds, Dictyostelium, they knew that they aggregated, and they knew that there was something you control that aggregation, but they couldn't figure out what it was, and all I could see was this spot on chromatography paper.
Right.
And so they called it Magic Spot and for about 5 years until they finally got it characterized.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. But yeah, it's something like that, you know. It'd be nice to cultivate those organisms so we could look at their specific mechanisms and their ecology. But at this point in time, we know enough that we can, some of the general enzymes that make those products are really useful, and then what controls them. So I'm looking at things like moisture and how human management of soils affects those processes for the detriment or for the benefit.
Could you say some of the things that you see there? Like what are the kinds of interesting effects that you're studying and that you're looking at, right? In terms of the effects of, you know, water or human activity on and what are the outcomes? Are you looking at mostly carbon sequestration or what other kinds of things are you mostly interested in?
So I guess the current topic that's I've been working on is soil health, but you know, that's very generic, and how do you improve soil health, and particularly the microbial aspects of that. We know the chemistry and the physics measurements, but microbial techniques, which, you know, we were just talking about, are fairly new. And so how do those measurements can be used to indicate direction of soil health? But the reason the interest in soil health is for multiple effects. One is carbon sequestration. You mentioned. Like I said, there's 2 to 3 times more carbon in soils than there is in the atmosphere or in vegetation. So understanding how that carbon is retained in that soil, how can we put more carbon to the benefit of the environment, to the atmosphere. So things that we're working on is we know that certain soil management practices like less tillage is beneficial for more fungi. And fungi are more efficient with their carbon, so more of their carbon they process is retained in the soil over bacteria. Also, we know that the fungal hyphae that permeate through the soil, just like if you look on your moldy bread, you know, those hyphal strands, those hyphae grab onto the soil particles and physically bind them together. And what happens is that organic carbon is trapped inside those aggregates, and that protects them. And that's one of the mechanisms for carbon sequestration. So I work on both ag systems and grassland ecosystems, the Kanza prairie here. And so I try to understand the principles of the prairie ecosystems because they're water resilient, they're nutrient efficient, and look at those principles and try to figure out how those principles could be applied to ag systems, make them more resilient, more efficient.
The idea of the microbiome, I think, is just absolutely fascinating. And the work you're doing obviously is on the agricultural side of it, and looking at the human side of microbiome and how those things are all going to fit together. I think in the future is going to open up new areas that we never even considered.
Yeah, we're at really, like I said, it's a fascinating time to be a microbiologist, a soil microbiologist, and there's going to be lots of job opportunities too.
So this is an area that is being viewed, this specific area, with more favor as far as funding potential?
Sure. Yeah. I think so. You just mentioned the $10 million grant. Part of that was a component of that was soil health, and how do you improve soil health as well as being more nitrogen efficient. The goal of the program is to be 50% more nitrogen efficient in ag systems, which is a really daunting task. But it's aspirational, but really, I'm biased, but I think microbes are at least part of the key for that, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But the National Academy of Sciences came out a report last year, talked about breakthroughs research needed in ag and food systems, and the plant and soil microbiome was one of the themes out of the 5.
Well, that's certainly hopeful.
Yes.
Yeah, you'd hate to find yourself in a situation of doing unsustainable research where you've got great.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, in USDA, NSF, DOE, all are currently putting more money into kind of the microbiome area.
A lot of the work that you're doing in the area of climate change, I mean, obviously that overlaps into this quite a bit. How do you respond to people that really don't believe that climate change is caused by things that we're doing today?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's changed over time. 20 years ago, it was a lot more controversial than it is now, but you still get the deniers or the skeptics. What I try to do, particularly if I'm giving a presentation, and there's usually skeptics in the room, is that I just try to show the data, and now it's easier to show some of the implications of that. So actually, this morning's class, I showed the rise in CO2 in the last 800,000 years, and if you put that concentration graph, it shows that it varied between 180 and 280 parts per million up until the beginning of the last century. But then there's been a huge increase. Not only have we surpassed the 280, when I came here at K-State in the late 1980s, we were doing experiments at looking at elevated CO2 effect on plants, and that was 350 parts per million. So we're above that 280, and today we're above 410 parts per million. And so just if you put it on a graph and a time scale, it's just sitting here bouncing around between 180 and 280, and then it shoots up dramatically. And so you can't deny that CO2. And so we're beyond what our human existence pretty much in that 100 or 800, almost a billion years. And then we talk about sources, and about 80% of that increase is from fossil fuels. And we know that because of the carbon signature of that. So we know it's traced back to fossil fuels. And the other 20% is from human activity, deforestation primarily. So that's two pieces. I show that data. And then I show, we talk about CO2 and as a gas heat trapping and the potential, and then try to show the temperature records. And again, like I say, it's a little bit easier now because the last 20 years it's continued, the temperature records for the planet, even for the country, U.S., has continued to rise, and we set new records almost every year, but certainly decade by decade. And now we're seeing the other things that's happening, and that's the change in extreme events, not only temperature, but also rainfall. And, the last few years, it's made it easier to talk about it because here, 2012, we had a major 3-year drought that affected Kansas and the central part of the U.S. And then last year, September or Labor Day last year, it rained 10 inches in about 4 hours and flooding. And then this spring, it's just been a disaster across the central part of the country with major floods and huge amounts of rainfall. This year, just in Manhattan, it's been, it seems like, we get a 4-inch rainstorm event each night, and every couple of weeks. So, and now we can track those, and so we can show, not even talking about the future, what's happened already is more extreme events, both on temperature and water. And then that's affected the agriculture sector, which tends to be one sector that's more conservative, not politically, but in the idea of climate change. So they're being affected with their normal operations. And then we can talk about the future implications. But the point here is that, these things are already observable now, and then what's the potential in the future.
Being able to look at that on a longer time scale must be a really big help, because I know farmers will tend to answer the, well, this is Kansas. We get
Right.
really good one year, really bad the other,
Right.
and that's just what it is. And
Right.
they don't look back into deeper time.
And they're right. The weather's
Yes.
always changing, and they've had to deal with it. But the problem is, or the challenge is, that those changes are occurring much in a greater extreme and much more rapidly. So you could breed a crop, and it takes 15, 20 years to produce a new variety. Well, 15 to 20 years, we're in a new paradigm. And so it's a challenge for agriculture, and it needs that investment in agriculture for the research to keep up with those increasingly rapid changes.
Do you have the opportunity to take this information out to an interdisciplinary group? You're
Sure.
obviously you're teaching within
Yeah.
your program, but you've got a lot of information, I think, that is valid.
Yeah, I've been fortunate, I guess, to have opportunities to talk to a variety of people, groups, from local citizens. I talked to, Kansas producers, but I gave a talk last fall, I guess it was, or earlier this year, in Wichita to one of the TV stations down there, and they had a panel and talked about climate change, and that was broadcasted on the NPR, or the TV equivalent of NPR. But then I try to present the facts, and then I guess one of the things is trying to relate it to a local level. That's one of the things I've learned, is figure out your audience and then present the material at that level. So I have talked to producers, but I've given testimony at the Kansas legislature or briefings in Congress, in the U.S. Congress, but I've even talked to the legislators in New Zealand, Brazil, and some other places. So it's given me a variety of opportunities to learn how to transfer that information to different groups.
How much of the research that you do is interdisciplinary too? I mean, so you've got this work with the IPCC, which is very interdisciplinary, right?
Yeah.
And is that the kind of thing where you just contributed? Sort of talk about how that happened, right?
Yeah. Well, you mean the process, how I got selected to be on the IPCC, or just,
and then what you did for it? Yeah.
So we had a little bit of background. We had a major grant from Congress to work on climate change and agriculture mitigation. And Kansas State was the lead, and I was the project director for that. It was 10 universities, or 10 institutions, and it was about $15 million. But that set us up, this was early 2000, so it set us up as the group of leading experts on agriculture. And so there was other countries that wanted to basically mimic our consortium, so Australia in particular. And so I got engaged with Australian scientists, and some of them were colleagues, soil scientists. That made it easier. But and so during that time period, the U.S. was doing bilateral negotiations on research on climate change. They weren't in the global UN effort. And so Australia came to us and said, we want to work with this group from K-State, or this consortium led by K-State. Well, one thing led to another, and the State Department was doing these bilateral negotiations, and they asked me to participate in those negotiations. So I would go and coordinate plans for research to coordinate between the U.S. and Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, and Canada were the 4 countries. But then the State Department asked if I'd be willing to be nominated for the IPCC. The process is that each country nominates a person, then that's sent to the UN center, and then they look for expertise, diversity, other criteria, and then I did get selected for 2 rounds to report that 2007 and the 2014 report. It's a fascinating process because you're right, it is interdisciplinary. So even in ag, if you think about it, there's soil scientists, but there's animal scientists, there's ag economics, there's sociology, modelers, engineers. So it's a very diverse, even when the ag sector. And then you have to, each chapter as it's written, so I was one of the lead authors for the ag chapter, but then you have to coordinate and then talk to how your piece fits in. It's like, for example, biofuels. Well, how does that fit into the transportation sector? So then you have to bring in a new whole cadre that don't know anything about soils or have perceptions on ag that are not necessarily true. And so it's just it's fascinating. And I could stay in my lab and do soil microbiology work, but to be transformative in what impacts the world, you need science is really complex now. You really have to be transdisciplinary in order to bring these complex systems in. I would argue ag is a complex system because it involves sociology, it involves the physical environment, the soils and the water and that, but then it's economics. And so one of my jokes is that USDA in these large grants required that you have a sociologist. And so it's not just putting them on the grant, but it's embedding them in the project. And so my joke was I'm not a very social person, and but I've learned to work with sociologists, but it's been really valuable and educational to understand why consumers or why farmers don't accept certain practices or understanding. And so it makes my work hopefully more impactful in that sense.
Has that kind of thing changed any of what you actually do, like in your work? Has it changed the direction of some of the projects or any of the actual research or methods?
Yeah, I guess I would. In one sense, no. I'm still doing my detailed field and lab experiments, but I now work with teams of people, and so I'm looking at how we can design ag systems that improve soil health or affect the microbiology, and then how those practices would be accepted by producers. And what's the economics? We were talking earlier, giving talks to various groups. I give briefings to Congress or a lot of times talks to producers. Okay, fine, the soil microbiology is great or soils are great, but, what does it mean to my bottom line, my profit? We can be sustainable all we want, but if you're not for soils, but if you're not providing a profit, that farm is not going to be sustainable. And so it has affected how I think about the whole system. And that's one of the advantages being on the National Academy Board is that it's pulling in from all these different disciplines and trying to develop what's the future of ag.
Can you talk a little bit more about the National Academy Board? This is clearly a very prestigious position,
yes, yeah.
And it's a something that your peers brought you into that and put you in that spot. So how does that work?
Yeah, so the National Academies, now it's all merged, sciences, engineering, and medicine. It used to be 3 separate. But they have the honorific, which are the fellows, but then they have an operational unit. It's still kind of called the National Research Council, but it kind of is really under the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. So under that, the Research Council, they have different divisions and different boards. So a while back, I guess about 9 years ago, I got asked to be a board member of the Board on Agriculture and Natural Resources. And then 3 years ago, I ended up being appointed as chair of that board, and I just found out yesterday I got reappointed for another three years. It's a, it's, well, one, it's prestigious, but the idea, at least my goal on the board, particularly as board chair, is we do different studies on issues related to the U.S., related to ag and natural resources. And part of our job is to be also looking at what's the future of ag and trying to help lead innovation in ag and natural resources. The challenge of our board is that we have ag and natural resources. So there's agriculture, but then there's also soil, water, forestry. And so they can be synergistic, but they can also be in conflict with each other. You know, if ag is imposing impacts on water or forestry. So it makes it challenging, but I think it also makes it fascinating because it is one whole ecosystem. And how can we have, sustain food production and sustain the environment?
Is the anticipation that you on the board will be advocates, or are you, is it a bully pulpit as well as a?
Well, yeah, we produce policy relevant information, and but so sometimes, the National Academy was set up by Abraham Lincoln the same year as same time period as the land grant system, universities. And so it was designed to provide scientific advice for Congress. And so we can be commissioned by Congress to do a study on a certain topic. And hopefully they provide money for that, or they direct the agencies to provide money for that. Because the studies aren't necessarily cheap, because you're bringing in expertise, and depends on the activity. It can be a 3-month or it could be a 3-year effort. So there's a lot of staff time. My time is volunteered. A lot of other people. All the studies, the experts are all volunteer time except for their travel. So then Congress, but more recently, will get groups, states, or even NGOs will come to the boards and say, we really need to have a study on this topic. We're doing one right now on soaring of Tennessee horses, which is looking at the ethics and how do you detect. Soaring is the gait walk of horses, and so there's training, but then they can also put devices in the hooves that cause pain and create that exaggerated gait. So what we're being asked to do is how can you detect some of that. So, here I'm in the ag and I'm dealing with, Tennessee walking horses. So I don't know where we're going on this, but it's advocacy. Yeah. So then we will. Then this recommendation will be, how do you detect that? And of course, that could lead to legislation in that sense. Citrus greening is a major issue for the orange industry. And so we were asked to evaluate their research program, and there's multitude of sources, as ag is typically. You got consumer groups, industry groups, the federal government supporting citrus research, and so it was very disoriented. And how do you bring those groups together and then figure out what are the top priorities to have a more effective program? It doesn't necessarily lead to, parts of it could lead to legislation, but it would be directed and say, okay, you need to coordinate better, and these are the topics. So, I'm trying to think. Food safety, of course, or right now we're looking at some of the innovations, robotics in ag. How do we spur that innovation? So the studies workshops could come out and say, okay, these are the priorities, and that would help direct industry and as well as the federal government on direction.
So a lot of people in the public, maybe elsewhere, right, start to think about science as a little more politicized now, right? And sort of part of that's like climate science, right? And sort of, the way you talked about it was just, here are the facts, right? But of course, a lot of people view this as, as John was just saying, sort of you're already like advocating or bully pulpiting, or you got an agenda, right? And in a lot of the things that you were just talking about, there is at least sort of, maybe some trade-offs or some areas where you might have some questions about, all right, so how much of what we're doing is really, value-driven or policy-driven, or we have a point or there's something we're trying to accomplish, and how much of what we're doing is really just like, here's the facts, folks, right, as we see them. How do you think about, I guess like all of that, either as it comes up on the national academies and other people on the board thinking about those issues, and, are they going too far? Are they being like truly objective, or can you be objective? And then, all the way back down to your science and IPCC. Yeah. It's a big, huge question, but just like in general, how do you think about these things?
Well, yeah. A couple of examples. The IPCC was probably a good one. The critics say, well, the IPCC is just pushing their own agenda. But I will tell you, if you've had in science, we write peer-reviewed manuscripts, and then you get outside people look at your work, and you don't get all these great comments.
No, you're not always low. That's true.
You get pages of that, and usually there's 2 or 3 reviewers. For the ag chapter alone, we had, I'm forgetting the number exactly, but over 2,000 individual comments. And we had to respond to each single comment. Now, we could say we accept that, we'll make changes, or no, this is wrong. And then we had a reviewer watching us to make sure we just didn't ignore those comments. And that, so you got to have the comments that you make or the recommendations you make aren't just off the cuff. They have to be based on scientific background. And so you have, hundreds of people watching you, and then the reviewers are watching, the other people are watching to make sure we're responding to those. So there's a lot of oversight. You can't just, forget the fact or the science, so, yeah. And so IPCC, we would say, this is, I forgot what the terms were, but this is likely, highly likely, and some uncertainty level, and there's a 50% chance that we're wrong or whatever. But, it's fair. The scientists are fairly conservative, so even if you say, well, it's a 90% chance that it might be right, it's probably a lot higher than that. But scientists, at least particularly in ag, we tend to be more conservative in our judgments.
Conservative, right. So not going too far.
In terms of establishing likelihood and all of that.
But there are cases, we're in negotiation or discussion for the National Academy to look at water in this country, groundwater, and it's probably as sensitive a topic as climate change, or maybe even more so, because our country doesn't have a water policy. It's as a whole. We have Kansas policy, we have Texas, and water is very dear to not only the state but to an individual.
And it doesn't respect state boundaries either.
It doesn't. Yes, that's right. And so Texas is very. You can pump it. Any water below your land, of course, it goes beyond that, but you can just pump until it runs dry. Kansas actually, as a state, has a more advanced water policy than most other states in this country, which is interesting.
California has its heritage system for water use.
So we've talked about how do you it's a major issue affecting agriculture, but also going to affect competition with industry and cities, and so that's already happening out west on surface waters. And so how do we need to look at what's the science behind, how you monitor what the recharge rate is, and then look at opportunities for efficiencies. But it's probably going to have to come into some discussion on water policy, which could be challenging, because of the state water rights issues. But we'll have to, if we're based on science, and say these are policy options, not prescriptive, but say, if you do this, this could affect, save water. You do this other policy or programs, it could undermine and increase water use. So, but it'll have to be the economists and sociologists to help design or provide those policy options. We're not saying it's this policy, but these are the implications of those different policies. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the clearest explanations of why we need sociologists and these kinds of folks.
Truly.
Honestly,
Yeah.
I'm serious. That was just spectacular.
Right. Yeah. But also why you need the science too, right? So
You've got to have them together.
The pieces, right? Sort of, it's the thinking about designing serious policy without having some science behind it, telling us what the implications are going to be of doing this thing or that thing, is just sort of mind-boggling to me. But
and that's why, I enjoy working these interdisciplinary groups is having that interaction and that other viewpoint to think about. Oh, yes, there's the economic or sociology piece. I can design ag practices, but if nobody takes them up, I haven't done the world any good.
This one's kind of a wide open question, but basically, what are your thoughts on the future of agriculture when you're talking? I mean, you've talked a lot about the science and the climate change and those kinds of things, but there are a lot of challenges coming forward.
Right. There's a lot of serious challenges, but agriculture in this country and around the world is in everybody's conversation, I think, now. It's a wonderful time to be in agriculture. But it's also, we got to get it right, because there's a lot of interest in ag right now, and so we need to take hold of that opportunity. There's lots of challenges. There's, the increasing population. How do we deal with increasing production, but also food waste? But how can we do that increased production without having impact on our natural resources, the forest, grasslands, soil, water. And so I really think, I was at a round table a week ago of innovations, or kind of really what you just talked about, future of ag and innovations. And so from a technical standpoint, we need to be innovative. Ag is one of the least technology advanced sectors. I think it's like 7 out of 8 or something. And so we need to look at those other sectors, but robotics, data acquisition, and data analytics are going to be critical. Looking at efficiencies, this new grant that we have, we're supposed to increase water use efficiency by rain-fed agriculture by 50% and nitrogen by 50%, as well as at the same time increase production by 2% annually.
Small ask.
Kind of, yeah.
Small ask.
So, but, I think if we can look at, there's a lot of startups, let me back up, there's a lot of startups now interested in ag. All the millennials from Google and all that, they're pumping millions and billions of dollars into ag startups. So I've been talking to companies, they're looking at robotics, and so instead of spraying a whole field for herbicides or chemicals, they got sensors on and spot spraying. Okay, this is a weed and this is a corn plant or a cotton plant. Okay, I want to spray this one, but not this one. And so you've reduced your chemical use, so that's profit for the farmer, but you also have less impact on the environment. So things like that are really key. We talked earlier about the microbiome. There's a lot of investment in looking at taking advantage of the soil microbiome to increase productivity and increase efficiency. So there's a company called Pivot Bio that has taking a microbe and adding it to corn plants, corn roots. So it's not a legume, or where it's not fixing nitrogen inside the root. It's actually living around that root, and it's fixing nitrogen and then shares that nitrogen to the corn plant. So it's in its early stages, but if it works, and I like the concept, then what that means is that we wouldn't have to apply as much commercial or synthetic fertilizer, and that makes it more efficient. Because if it's fixing nitrogen as the plant is growing, then it's sharing that nitrogen and not giving it, and then it's not available for losses out of the system.
What's the advantage to the microbe? I can see the advantage to the corn plant.
They're living in the root and they're getting the carbon.
Okay, so
root exudates from the plant, and so they're after carbon, they're after energy, and so if you added a foreign microbe to the general soil, it couldn't compete, because there are microbes out there that are used to low nutrient, low carbon status. We think soils are rich, but relative laboratory media, they're very poor. And so the general biology additives to soil generally don't work. But now you have this root rhizosphere that's a special niche. So it's almost like a laboratory culture. And so you can add that microbe, and it's getting the carbon, a continuous supply of carbon as the plant is growing. Right. And then it's fixing nitrogen, and they've manipulated the microbe so it fixes excess nitrogen, and then that nitrogen goes then to feed the corn plant.
Typical post-harvest biochemist asking a pre-harvest question out of ignorance, I think.
Yeah.
So
thanks.
So how much of this, you study grasslands too, right? So how many of the kinds of things like that you're talking about are mimicking processes that are, that you see in grasslands, and how much is it sort of like brand new, innovative, like we're going to do something different?
Yeah, so I guess the basic ecology, if you look at like the tallgrass prairie, it's never tilled. Okay, so we don't have to do tillage, and that's what we're trying to promote in ag is no-till systems. But it has diversity there, and we can come back to that because it has different plant communities. But we don't add nitrogen or nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, other nutrients to the system other than what comes through the rainfall. So their nitrogen economy of that system is either recycle it or do some nitrogen fixation. Well, it turns out most of the prairie nitrogen is recycled. It's very, very nitrogen efficient. But it's also, in my model, climate resilient. The droughts, it slows down. It has deep rooting systems. It has diversity in there. So it's climate resilient. It's water efficient. It's nutrient efficient, and it's a fairly stable ecosystem. You don't have pest outbreaks and wipe through. Well, so how does that translate to ag? So there's just those basic principles. Well, can we design that we don't have to tillage? So we got no-till. We're still planting monoculture, a single crop, which, some people think, well, we can do polyculture and that's going to be hard to do. But can we increase the diversity, not maybe in space in one point in time, but can we increase that diversity over time? So the value is then you plant a corn crop and then you have cover crops or you do rotation. Instead of plant corn every year, you plant corn, soybean, wheat, or other crops and do cover crops so you can have continuous cover, so it's more like the prairie. You can actually choose your cover crops for what you want to do for the soil. So say if I got compaction, I want to plant a tuberous crop like tillage radish or turnips that'll create biopores in the soil. You don't have to till it. Or I want nitrogen. Well, I plant a legume in that system to fix nitrogen for the succeeding crop. So we need to have designer cover crops or mixes to make the ag system more efficient and resilient. And then part of the innovation is that a lot of people are going out and bioprospecting those microbes in those root systems to figure out, okay, can we take those microbes and then put them into an ag system?
Cool. Could you say something about why polyculture is a challenge? Is it sociological? Is it economic? Or is it sort of a matter of the, I don't know, other aspects of the biological processes?
Yeah. Well, if you think about like the prairie, you got hundreds of different kinds of plants. But say even a polyculture, Land Institute, West Jackson was really doing the polyculture work. They backed off a little bit and now are looking at perennial sorghums and wheats and that. But the polyculture conceptually is nice because you have a diverse mix out there. You don't have pest outbreaks are going to be less. But the problem is, how do you harvest that? Now, if you're going to graze it, that's fine. You put animals out there and graze it. But if I want I want to harvest the grain from a wheat and a corn and some legume. I got 3 different species out there that are going to mature at different times, and then I got to figure out how to separate the grain. And if they mature at different times, if one's ready to harvest, the other one isn't. But if I wait till the one that's later, the first one's probably going to shatter. And so some of it's technological, but then I guess it's somewhat sociological in the sense of how do you manage 3 or 4 crops growing at the same time. And so, the systems we were talking about earlier with cover crops and rotations, it takes a lot more knowledge and skill. Well, now if you got 3 or 4 crops growing at the same time, the management skills have to increase dramatically.
Are there similar issues with the managing the microbiology of the soils, do you think, in terms of the complications and how much additional, basically management and expertise it takes?
That's a good question. I haven't thought of it that way. I guess from a inoculant side, adding these organisms like the corn, we're used to adding treatments onto corn seed or soybean seeds generally for pest control. But in legumes, we coat legume seeds for rhizobia that fix nitrogen. We got 50, 70 years of experience in that area. So that's not necessarily a new technology, and it's just you inoculate your seed, you plant it, and then you just you provide the environment. So you're not actively managing those microbes. It's providing a good environment and then adding the inoculant to that. I suppose there'd be certain things you got to worry about if you're doing seed treatment, adding a fungicide that might affect that added microbe or added bacteria. If you're adding chemical fertilizer, you got to make sure it doesn't isn't caustic to those microbes. So there's a little bit of that, but we're probably, I guess I wouldn't, it's those are practices that most farmers are used to dealing with.
When you're talking about diversity, the scale you're talking about maybe 3 different plants going in, corn and wheat or whatever it might be. What are your thoughts on kind of the small farming, the smaller farming type practices that I know with the reduction in population in western Kansas, the state looks at ways of trying to increase population and bringing in other kinds of growing patterns. What are your thoughts on the small versus the very large agricultural practices?
Yeah, well, I guess from a technology standpoint, these innovations, I think they're scale neutral. At least I hope they are. They may be modifications, but in my global travels, I was so one thing that we do, like to manage nitrogen, is look at sensors to detect the greenness of plants, and if it's less green, that means it's generally nitrogen deficient. So then you can go in and apply more nitrogen. Well, so we got drones and other on tractor sensors. But I was at a 1 acre rice paddy in Vietnam, and they were using their smartphone and sensing the greenness, color from the smartphone. And then one of the international research centers, Erie, had developed an application. Well, then this is how much nitrogen you need to put on your rice. So here's, a 1 acre rice paddy farmer in Vietnam and a cell phone or smartphone technology. And so in that case, it's technology neutral. It's packaging it differently, but the information still is applicable. I've heard people say, well, no-till has to be large-scale, big farms. But Brazil you can plant no-till by hand. Or they got no-till planters that are horse-drawn or oxen-drawn. So it doesn't have to be. Now, and there are some farmers, at least in Brazil I've seen, that are doing organic no-till, not using herbicides. It's possible, but it's a lot harder. We talk about the sociological aspects. The management skills required for organic no-till is much higher skill level and management skills.
So when you get into some of the smaller farming practices, I didn't take my question to the level it needed to be, and you're looking at small farmers putting in a variety of different vegetables, fruits, grains, whatever it might be. Is there more of a positive impact on the microbiological soil?
Yeah. So, because if you get more plant root systems, we're worried about the above ground, but more root variety is a good thing for the microbes because they're feeding off of different sources of types of food from that roots. So, I talked about earlier, increasing diversity, and that was probably more big farms, is adding cover crops and rotations in that sense. But a small farmer can actually do it easier because he or she can plant, it's a very common practice to plant corn and then beans in a row. And if they're hand harvesting, that's easier to do than trying to run a machine through these rows and crushing your in a row thing. So you could do things some of the things you could actually do easier on the small holding. So the principles still apply. And going back to soil health, particularly the continent of Africa, a lot of those countries, I was in Ghana in February, they really need soil health because their soils are so devoid of organic matter. And if you could improve organic matter, improve aggregation, so when it does rain, it infiltrates and then it's held in the soil, then that makes those soils in those small holding farmers much more resilient and not subject to the variety of climate extremes, weather extremes. All comes back to the soil.
The fundamentals, yes. You talked a little bit, I think, earlier about the grant that you've got coming in. What are the outcomes that you're looking for from that program?
Well, so it's a 5-year program. It's based in Southern Great Plains, primarily Oklahoma and Kansas. And the idea is to, I mentioned earlier, but the idea is to develop systems that are that increase production, also increase total factor productivity, and that's an economist. So again, working in these transdisciplinary areas, I had to figure that one out. But simply, it's looking at how much input you put in and what's the output, and so the efficiency or the cost per unit of bushel or grain produced. And then we have to increase water and nitrogen efficiency by 50%. I forgot the time frame, but we have to provide the tools for that. We aren't going to do it in 5 years. And then also be climate resilient. And so if you think of Kansas and Oklahoma in the non-irrigated areas, we are extremely vulnerable to these weather extremes, and we talked about that, from super dry to almost flooded conditions. So we have a group at University of Maryland that's also involved in the project, and they have expertise on modeling, and particularly they've looked at weather, weather probabilities. So I've seen this at CIAT in Columbia, where if, for example, in April, we can look at the winter weather, what's the probability that the summer is going to be a wet year, or dry year, or cool or wet? And so it's not a climate model, but it's more of a statistical model, and say we got a 30% chance it's going to be dry, or 30% chance it's wet. So can we take that information, and this will be the challenge, and I predict we will fail many times, but that's okay. You learn from failure. But can we say, okay, there's a 30% chance it's going to be a wet year, or a 50% chance? Well, instead of planting your normal summer crop, should we look for something that can take advantage of the extra water? So instead of planting, so you harvest your wheat, and now if it's going to be a wet year, the chances are maybe we can go to double cropping with sorghum, or even if it's really wet, corn, okay? Or if it's going to be a dry year, maybe we aren't going to double crop, but we want to keep that soil covered. Well, maybe we plant a summer forage, and then that forage can be used for hay. So there's still a little bit of income, but you're still keeping that soil covered and keeping the microbes fed, and some economic production from that. So looking at tying in improve soil health to be more climate resilient, and maybe some weather projections. I won't say predictions, but projections. It'll be a challenge, and that's why I said I think I expect we will fail. But I hope that we will have some successes or learn from those failures, because I'm sure there'll be times when we say, okay, it's going to be a wet year, and it's not. Okay, so that's what science and innovation should do. We hope to get involved some of the technology. So can we put in-ground sensors for soil water, for nitrogen, to make on-the-go decisions too? So I'm excited. I think it's a huge opportunity, a great opportunity. And if we're truly innovative, can we really produce some transformational change, not incremental, but transformational changes in ag?
Very exciting.
Yeah.
Sounds like a really exciting project. Well, the last question that I had in my mind to bring to you was just something on the Nobel Prize that you were named in 2007. Can you give us a little bit of background on what that was all about?
Yeah, that was interesting. I wasn't even aware that we were even up for it. So the first thing is it was for the IPCC report that came out in 2007. and it was for the entire group. So, it's not like I won the Nobel Peace Prize. I did, but I shared in it with several hundred other scientists or authors of that report. Like I said, I wasn't even aware that we were up for it. I woke up that morning and had a text from one of the faculty members on campus said, "Congratulations on winning the Nobel Prize." I thought it was a joke, and then for a while there, we weren't sure because it was a shared prize, and it was actually split with Al Gore. He got half of it, and then the IPCC got the second half, and so we weren't sure it was for the name group or for us included. And so there was a lot of confusion that morning saying, okay, are we individual recipients? And but anyway, it turned out that it was a shared, but we are part of that sharing process. And in fact, there was a lottery for groups. You can send 20 people to the ceremonies in Norway. And so, of course, all the administrators, leaders got there, but I think there was, out of that 20, I think there was 6 slots available. So there was a lottery, and I had the potential. Unfortunately, I didn't win the lottery. But we got a plaque, and there's artwork associated with each Nobel Prize, and so we got a copy of that artwork on that. So
that's very nice.
Yeah, so it's kind of it was cool.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. Very, very, very nice. So, okay, are there any other questions? I know that we've want to be conscious of your time and the other folks around the table. Do you have anything more you want to add?
No.
Any questions of us?
No, not that I can think of. It's been good, yeah.
Been a great conversation.
It really has.
Good.
And thanks for the time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
If you have any questions or comments you would like to share, check out our website at ksu.edu/research/global food and drop us an email. Our music was adapted from Wayne Gowen's album, Chronicles of Carmela. Special thanks to him for providing that to us. Something to Chew On is produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University.